Marcus Chen had seen enough death to last 3 lifetimes. The scars that crisscrossed his weathered hands told stories of battles fought across 7 different star systems, each one leaving its mark not just on his flesh, but deep in his soul. Now, at 45, he found himself on Kepler 442b, a frontier colony world where humans and aliens tried to coexist in an uneasy peace that felt more like a temporary ceasefire than true harmony. The morning air was thick with the smell of burnt ozone and alien spices as Marcus walked through the lower districts of New Geneva, the sprawling settlement that served as the planet's de facto capital. His prosthetic left leg clicked against the metal walkways with each step, a constant reminder of the plasma mine that had ended his military career 5 years ago. These days, he worked as a maintenance supervisor for the colony's water purification systems, a job that kept him busy enough to avoid thinking too much about the past. The alien districts were always busier in the early hours. The Zephyrians, with their tall, willowy frames and iridescent blue skin, moved through the crowds with graceful efficiency. Their children, smaller versions with the same ethereal beauty, darted between the adults like schools of fish navigating coral reefs. Marcus had grown used to their presence over the years, though he still felt like an outsider whenever he passed through their neighborhoods. It was near the old water treatment facility that he first noticed the small metallic object half buried beneath a pile of construction debris. Something about it caught his eye. Maybe because it seemed too deliberately shaped to be random trash. Marcus paused, his practiced gaze sweeping the area for any signs of danger. Old habits died hard, and in his experience, anything out of place could mean trouble. The object turned out to be a lunchbox, though unlike any human design he had ever seen. It was roughly rectangular but with smooth, curved edges that seemed to flow like water frozen in time. The metal had an opalescent quality that shifted between deep purple and silver depending on the angle of the light. Intricate patterns were etched into the surface, not quite geometric but not entirely organic either. It was beautiful in the way that Zephyrian art often was, full of meaning that humans could appreciate without fully understanding. Marcus picked it up carefully, surprised by how light it felt despite its solid appearance. The hinges moved smoothly when he opened it, revealing an interior lined with what looked like soft, bioluminescent moss that had long since gone dark. The lunchbox was empty, but it clearly belonged to someone who had taken great care in choosing it. This wasn't some mass-produced container, but something crafted with love and attention to detail. He was about to set it aside when he noticed something else. Tucked into one corner of the box was a small piece of what looked like paper, though the texture was wrong for human manufacturing. Marcus unfolded it carefully, revealing a drawing done in the distinctive flowing style that Zephyrian children used. The image showed 2 figures, one tall and one small, standing together beneath what might have been a tree or perhaps some kind of architectural structure. The smaller figure was holding something in its hands, offering it to the larger one. Below the drawing, in the careful script that young Zephyrians learned in their educational centers, were words written in both Zephyrian and broken English. The English translation was clearly the work of a child still learning the language. "For Papa when he comes home. Love always, Lyra." Marcus felt something twist in his chest, a familiar ache that he had learned to suppress during his years of service. The drawing was old, the edges worn from repeated handling, and the bioluminescent moss in the lunchbox had been dead for weeks, maybe months. This wasn't just an abandoned lunch container. This was a child's gift to a father who might never come home to receive it. The veteran stood there for a long moment, holding the lunchbox and its precious contents, while the sounds of the colony continued around him. Zephyrian workers moved past him on their way to the industrial districts, their musical voices creating a constant backdrop of conversation he couldn't quite follow. Somewhere in the distance, a transport ship was warming its engines, preparing for another jump to the outer rim territories where the fighting never seemed to end. Marcus had seen plenty of war orphans during his time in the service. Human children in bombed-out cities, alien young ones separated from their families during evacuations, whole generations growing up without parents because of conflicts they had no part in starting. He had always done his job, followed orders, completed missions, but he had learned early on that survival meant not getting too attached to the casualties along the way. The moment you started seeing individuals instead of statistics was the moment you lost the emotional distance necessary to function in a war zone. But somehow, holding this small alien girl's lunchbox in his hands, Marcus felt all those carefully constructed barriers beginning to crack. Maybe it was because he was older now, no longer an active soldier with a mission to complete. Maybe it was because the war had officially ended 6 months ago, leaving everyone to figure out what peace actually looked like. Or maybe it was simply because he had seen too much death and was desperate to do something, anything, that might balance the scales just a little bit. He closed the lunchbox carefully and tucked the drawing back into its corner. The smart thing would be to turn it over to the colony administration, let them add it to the growing pile of unclaimed personal effects that filled an entire warehouse on the outskirts of New Geneva. The smart thing would be to walk away, go to work, and forget about a child he had never met, and her father, who was probably never coming home. Instead, Marcus found himself walking deeper into the Zephyrian districts, the lunchbox cradled against his chest like something precious and fragile. The neighborhoods here were different from the human sections of the colony. The buildings curved upward in spirals that followed no architectural logic he understood, and the streets were laid out in patterns that seemed random until you realized they were designed to complement the natural flow of wind and light. Everything was designed with an aesthetic sensibility that prioritized beauty and harmony over efficiency and function. Children played in small groups throughout the area, their high musical laughter creating a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Marcus watched them as he walked, looking for any sign of a young girl who might be missing her lunchbox. Most of the children seemed well cared for, their clothing clean and their faces bright with the kind of joy that children everywhere shared regardless of species. But as he moved deeper into the district, the buildings became more cramped, and the children's clothing showed signs of wear that spoke of families struggling to make ends meet. It was in one of these poorer neighborhoods that Marcus finally saw her. She was sitting alone on the steps of a building that had seen better days, her small frame hunched over something in her lap. Her iridescent blue skin had the slightly dull quality that indicated poor nutrition, and her clothes, while clean, had been mended multiple times. She was drawing on a piece of salvaged material, using what looked like charcoal from a cooking fire to create images that showed the same flowing style as the drawing in the lunchbox. Marcus approached slowly, his military training making him automatically assess the situation for potential threats. The girl looked up as he drew near, her large, dark eyes showing the kind of wariness that children developed when they had learned not to trust easily. She was young, probably no more than 8 or 9 in human years, though alien development patterns made it difficult to be certain. "Excuse me?" Marcus said in his careful, accented Zephyrian, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth despite years of practice. "I found something that might belong to you." The girl tilted her head in the gesture that Zephyrians use to indicate curious attention, her expression shifting from wariness to interest. Marcus held out the lunchbox, watching as her eyes went wide with recognition and something that might have been hope. "My box," she whispered in English, the words barely audible. "Papa's box." She reached out with trembling fingers. touching the surface of the lunchbox as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Marcus knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level as he had learned to do with frightened children in refugee camps. Up close, he could see that her eyes held a depth of sadness that no child should carry, and the careful way she moved suggested someone who had learned to be very, very careful about everything. "Is your name Lyra?" he asked gently, still speaking in Zephyrian, though his accent made the musical language sound harsh and foreign. The girl nodded, her attention entirely focused on the lunchbox. She opened it with the reverence of someone handling a religious artifact, her small fingers tracing the patterns on the inside where the moss had once glowed. When she found the drawing still tucked in its corner, she pulled it out and pressed it against her chest, closing her eyes as if trying to absorb some essence from the worn paper. Marcus felt something break open in his chest, a flood of emotion that he had been holding back for longer than he cared to admit. This child, this small alien girl with her father's lunchbox and her careful drawings, represented everything he had been fighting for during his years of service. Not the grand political objectives or the strategic advantages that the generals talked about in their briefings, but the simple right of children to grow up safe and loved and unafraid. "Where is your family?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lyra's eyes opened, and she looked at him with the kind of direct gaze that adults often found uncomfortable in children. "Papa went to fight," she said in her halting English. "Mama says he will come back, but it has been very long time. Mama works in the factories now. She is always tired." Marcus nodded, understanding more than the child's limited vocabulary could express. Zephyrian families were tight-knit units, where multiple generations often lived together. But the war had scattered communities and broken traditional support systems. Single mothers struggling to provide for their children while waiting for news of husbands and fathers who might never return was a story he had seen repeated countless times across multiple worlds. "The lunchbox," he said carefully. "Your papa made it for you?" Lyra shook her head, a small smile crossing her face for the first time since he had approached. "I made it for Papa," she said with obvious pride. "For when he comes home from fighting. I save food for him every day, but then we moved and I lost it. Mama said not to worry. Papa would understand, but I wanted to give him something special." The simple explanation hit Marcus harder than any explosion or enemy fire ever had. This child had been preparing a gift for her father's return, saving portions of her own food in a handmade lunchbox, carrying it with her through whatever upheavals had forced her family to relocate. She had lost it in the chaos of displacement, but she had never stopped hoping that her father would come home to receive it. Marcus found himself thinking about his own father, a career military man who had spent more time deployed than at home during Marcus's childhood. He remembered the elaborate welcome home celebrations his mother used to plan, the careful way she coached him on what to say when Daddy came back from his missions. The difference was that his father had always come home, until the day he was too old to deploy and retired to a quiet civilian life. Not everyone was so lucky. "Lyra," he said, making a decision that surprised him with its clarity. "Would you like me to help you put something new in the lunchbox? Something for when your papa comes home?" The girl's eyes lit up with the first genuine happiness he had seen from her, and she nodded eagerly. Marcus looked around the small courtyard where they sat, noting the other children who had begun to gather at a safe distance, watching the strange human with curiosity and caution. He saw the worn buildings, the makeshift repairs, the careful way that families here stretched resources to make them last. This was a community that had learned to survive by taking care of each other, but survival and thriving were not the same thing. "Tell me about your papa," Marcus said, settling down more comfortably on the steps beside her. "What kind of things did he like? What made him happy?" Lyra's face brightened as she began to talk. her English mixed with Zephyrian words when she couldn't find the right translation. She told him about her father's job as an engineer, how he used to create beautiful things that were both functional and artistic. She described the games they played together, the stories he told her about the old days before the war, the way he could make their small apartment feel like the safest place in the universe just by being there. As she spoke, Marcus found himself remembering his own relationship with his father, but also thinking about the children he had encountered during his military service. The war orphans in the camps, the displaced families seeking refuge in overcrowded shelters, the young ones who had learned to be silent and invisible because drawing attention could be dangerous. They all shared the same fundamental need: to be seen, to be valued, to know that their lives mattered to someone. The lunchbox sat between them on the steps, its opalescent surface catching the light from Kepler 442b's twin suns. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was a symbol of hope maintained in the face of impossible circumstances. A child's faith that love could survive separation, that families could be reunited, that the world could return to something resembling normal if you just held on long enough. Marcus realized that he had been given something precious, the opportunity to do something small but meaningful in a universe that often seemed determined to crush hope wherever it appeared. He couldn't bring Lyra's father home, couldn't undo the war or its consequences, couldn't solve the larger problems that kept families separated and communities struggling. But he could help a little girl prepare a gift for her father's return. And maybe, in doing so, he could find some small measure of redemption for the things he had seen and done during his years of service. "I have an idea," he said finally, "but it will take some time. Would you be willing to work with me on this?" Lyra nodded solemnly, clutching the lunchbox against her chest as if it were a lifeline. "I can work hard," she said, with the seriousness that children displayed when they were determined to prove themselves worthy of adult attention. "I am very good at working hard," Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in months. "I believe you are," he said. "Let's go find your mother. I think this is going to be a project that all three of us need to work on together." As they stood up from the steps, Marcus felt the weight of the lunchbox in Lyra's small hands, but also the weight of responsibility that he was choosing to take on. He had spent years following orders, completing missions, serving a cause that he believed in even when he couldn't see its ultimate purpose. Now, for the first time in a long while, he was choosing his own mission: to help a little girl believe that hope was still possible, even in a universe that had taken so much from so many. The walk through the Zephyrian district took on a different quality as they moved together toward Lyra's home. Marcus found himself noticing details he had missed before: the way the community members looked out for each other's children, the small gardens that families maintained in whatever space they could find, the quiet determination that kept people moving forward even when the future seemed uncertain. This was what they had been fighting for, he realized. Not the abstract ideals that politicians and generals discussed in their speeches, but the simple right of communities to exist, to raise their children, to maintain their cultures and traditions, even in the face of upheaval and change. The war might be over, but the work of building peace was just beginning, and maybe, just maybe, it started with small acts of kindness between strangers who decided to see each other as something more than alien faces in a crowd. Lyra's home turned out to be 3 floors up in a building that had once been elegant, but now showed signs of too many families packed into spaces meant for fewer people. The elevator was broken, as seemed to be the case with most mechanical things in this part of the district, so Marcus followed the little girl up narrow stairs that creaked under their combined weight. His prosthetic leg made the climb more difficult than it should have been, but he managed to keep up with Lyra's eager pace. The apartment was small but meticulously clean, with the kind of careful organization that spoke of someone making the most of limited space. Traditional Zephyrian decorations hung on the walls alongside children's drawings, creating a blend of cultural heritage and family life that felt both foreign and familiar to Marcus. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once, with sleeping quarters behind a curtain that had been mended so many times it looked more like patchwork than original fabric. Lyra's mother was at the small cooking unit, preparing what smelled like a traditional Zephyrian stew from ingredients that Marcus suspected represented a significant portion of the family's food budget. She turned when they entered, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to alarm when she saw a human stranger accompanying her daughter. Her hand moved instinctively toward a cutting tool on the counter, not in obvious threat, but in the way of someone who had learned to be ready for trouble. "Mama," Lyra said quickly in Zephyrian, her voice bright with excitement. "This is the man who found Papa's box. He brought it back to me." The woman's posture relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained cautious as they fixed on Marcus. She was tall even by Zephyrian standards, with the same iridescent blue skin as her daughter, but marked by the kind of exhaustion that came from working too many hours for too little pay. Her clothes were as carefully mended as everything else in the apartment, and Marcus noticed that her hands bore the calluses and small scars that came from factory work. "I am Zara," she said in careful English, her accent much thicker than her daughter's. "Lyra has told me about the lost box. We thought it was gone forever." Marcus introduced himself, explaining in his halting Zephyrian how he had found the lunchbox and why he had wanted to return it personally. As he spoke, he watched Zara's expression shift from suspicion to something that might have been gratitude, though she remained guarded in the way that people learned when they had been disappointed too many times. "You did not have to bring it yourself," she said finally. "The authorities have offices for such things." "I know," Marcus replied. "But I wanted to meet Lyra, and I wanted to ask if there might be something I could do to help." Zara's eyes narrowed slightly, the wariness returning. "Help with what?" Marcus gestured toward the lunchbox, which Lyra was holding against her chest like a treasured possession. "Your daughter told me she made this for her father's return. I was thinking that maybe we could work together to put something special inside it, something that would really show him how much she has thought about him while he was gone." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Zara looked at her daughter, then back at Marcus, her expression cycling through emotions he couldn't quite read. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was carefully controlled. "Lyra's father is not coming home," she said quietly. "The notification came 3 weeks ago. He died in the fighting on Proxima Station." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He looked at Lyra, who was still holding the lunchbox with that expression of hopeful anticipation, and felt something crumble inside his chest. The child didn't know. Her mother was protecting her from a truth too terrible for a young mind to process, allowing her to maintain hope in a situation where hope was a form of kindness. "I understand," Marcus said carefully, his voice low enough that Lyra wouldn't catch the full meaning of the conversation. "But perhaps that makes the project even more important." Zara studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus found himself thinking about all the conversations he had witnessed between military families during his years of service, the careful ways that surviving spouses tried to preserve their children's innocence while dealing with their own grief, the impossible balance between truth and protection that every parent in wartime had to navigate. "She asks about him every day," Zara said finally. "When will Papa come home? Why hasn't he sent a message? Did I remember to tell him about her new drawings? I keep thinking I will find the right words to explain, but then I see how happy she is when she talks about the things they will do together, and I cannot bring myself to take that away from her." Marcus nodded. understanding more than Zara probably realized. He had seen grief take many forms during his military career, but one of the cruelest was the grief of parents who had to choose between protecting their children and preparing them for reality. There was no right answer, no perfect way to handle the devastating news that a father who had promised to come home would never walk through the door again. "What if," Marcus said slowly, working through the idea as he spoke, "what if we created something that could serve both purposes? Something that celebrates her love for her father, but also helps her understand that love doesn't end just because someone can't come home?" Lyra had wandered over to the small window that looked out over the district's central courtyard, her attention captured by something happening in the street below. Marcus could see her reflection in the glass, the way she unconsciously traced patterns on the window with her finger, the same flowing designs that appeared in her drawings and on the lunchbox. "She has his talent for creating beautiful things," Zara said, following Marcus's gaze. "Before the war, he was one of the finest ornamental engineers in the sector. He could take raw materials and make them into objects that were both functional and artistic. Lyra has the same gift, but I do not have the resources to help her develop it properly." Marcus felt a spark of recognition, a sense of possibility that he hadn't experienced since his discharge from the military. "What kind of materials would she need?" Zara laughed, but it was a sound without much humor. "Everything we cannot afford. Proper tools, quality metals, access to fabrication equipment, the kind of things that were available before the war disrupted the supply chains and made everything 10 times more expensive." "What if I told you that I have access to fabrication equipment," Marcus said, "and that I might be able to help Lyra learn to use it?" The conversation that followed was careful and tentative, with both adults aware that they were negotiating something more complex than a simple favor. Zara was protective of her daughter and suspicious of Marcus's motives, which he understood completely. He was, after all, a stranger from a different species who had appeared in their lives with no clear reason for wanting to help. In her position, he would have been equally cautious. But as they talked, Marcus found himself sharing more about his own background than he had intended. He told Zara about his military service, about the prosthetic leg and the early retirement that had left him searching for a new sense of purpose. He talked about the water treatment facility where he worked, and the fabrication equipment that the human administration had installed there for making replacement parts and custom modifications. Most importantly, he talked about the war orphans he had encountered during his service, and how he had always wished he could do more for them than simply following orders and moving on to the next mission. He found himself describing feelings he had never put into words before, the sense of incompleteness that had followed him through his civilian life, the feeling that he had seen too much suffering without being able to balance it with enough meaningful action. "I am not asking you to trust me completely," he said finally. "I am asking you to let me prove that I can be trusted. Let me work with Lyra on this project, and if at any point you are not comfortable with the arrangement, it ends immediately." Zara considered this for a long moment, her gaze moving between Marcus and her daughter, who was now showing signs of restlessness as the adult conversation continued without her involvement. Finally, she nodded. "We will try," she said, "but there will be conditions." The conditions turned out to be eminently reasonable. Marcus would meet with Lyra only in public spaces or in the presence of her mother. Any materials or tools he provided would become Lyra's property regardless of how the project ended. And most importantly, he would respect Zara's decisions about when and how to tell Lyra the truth about her father. With those boundaries established, they called Lyra over to join the conversation. Marcus explained his idea in terms a child could understand. They would create something beautiful to go inside the lunchbox, something that would show how much she loved her father and how much he meant to her. It would be a project that combined her artistic talent with his technical knowledge, and when they were finished, she would have something truly special. Lyra's enthusiasm was immediate and infectious. She began talking rapidly about her ideas, mixing English and Zephyrian as she described the kinds of things her father had taught her about combining beauty with function. She pulled out more of her drawings, showing Marcus the intricate patterns she had been developing, the way she thought about space and flow, and the interaction between different design elements. Marcus found himself impressed by the sophistication of her artistic instincts. Even accounting for species differences in aesthetic sensibility, Lyra clearly had an exceptional talent for visual design. More than that, she had an intuitive understanding of how to create objects that served both practical and emotional purposes, which was exactly the skill that would be needed for this project. The next few weeks fell into a routine that surprised Marcus with how natural it felt. He would finish his shifts at the water treatment facility and then meet Lyra and Zara at various locations around the district. Sometimes they worked in the small fabrication lab that the human administration had set up for community use. Sometimes they gathered in the courtyard of Lyra's building, where other children would cluster around to watch their project take shape. Marcus began by teaching Lyra the basics of working with the kind of advanced materials that were available through the colony's supply systems. He showed her how to use molecular assemblers to create complex structures at the microscopic level, how to program bioluminescent organisms to create specific patterns of light, how to combine organic and inorganic elements in ways that would have been impossible with traditional manufacturing techniques. But more than the technical skills, he found himself learning from Lyra's approach to the creative process. Where Marcus thought in terms of specifications and tolerances, Lyra thought in terms of stories and emotions. She wanted their creation to tell the story of her relationship with her father, to capture not just what he looked like or what he had done, but how he had made her feel safe and loved and capable of creating beautiful things herself. The project evolved slowly, taking shape through a series of iterations and refinements that reflected both of their contributions. They settled on creating a small sculpture that would fit perfectly inside the lunchbox, something that combined traditional Zephyrian artistic techniques with the kind of advanced materials that Marcus had access to through his work. The sculpture would be functional as well as beautiful, serving as a recording device that could preserve messages and play them back through a combination of light and sound that was uniquely Zephyrian. As they worked, Marcus began to understand more about the community that Lyra and her family were part of. The Zephyrian district was home to thousands of refugees and displaced persons, families who had fled the fighting on other worlds and ended up on Kepler 442b, not by choice, but by necessity. They were trying to rebuild their lives in an environment that was often hostile or indifferent to their needs, maintaining their cultural traditions while adapting to circumstances they had never chosen. The community had developed its own support systems, networks of mutual aid that helped families survive when the official assistance programs fell short. Children looked out for each other across family lines. Elderly members shared knowledge and skills with younger generations, and everyone contributed what they could to the collective effort of simply getting by. Marcus found himself drawn into this network almost without realizing it. He started bringing extra materials from the fabrication lab, ostensibly for Lyra's project, but really to share with other families who had children interested in learning technical skills. He began staying after their work sessions to help with small repairs around the building, using his engineering background to fix problems that the residents couldn't afford to address through official channels. Most surprisingly, he started learning Zephyrian in earnest, not just the basic vocabulary he needed for work, but the deeper language that allowed him to understand the cultural concepts and emotional expressions that were essential to real communication. Lyra became his informal teacher, delighting in correcting his pronunciation and explaining the subtle differences between words that seemed identical to human ears. The turning point came during the fourth week of their project, when Lyra asked a question that Marcus had been dreading. "Why does Papa never answer when Mama sends messages to the fleet?" she asked one afternoon as they worked on calibrating the bioluminescent elements of their sculpture. "I drew him a new picture last week, but Mama says the communication systems are not working properly." Marcus glanced across the room to where Zara was working on a traditional weaving project with several other women from the building. Their eyes met, and he saw the pain that she had been carrying alone for weeks, the impossible burden of protecting her daughter from a truth that grew heavier with each passing day. "Sometimes," Marcus said carefully, "the fighting in space makes it very difficult for messages to get through. The communication networks get damaged, and it can take a long time to repair them." Lyra nodded seriously, accepting this explanation as she had accepted all the others. But Marcus could see that she was beginning to understand that something was wrong, that the absence of communication meant more than just technical difficulties. Children were remarkably perceptive, especially children who had already experienced disruption and loss in their lives. That evening, after Lyra had gone to sleep, Marcus and Zara sat in the small courtyard behind the building and had the conversation that had been building between them for weeks. Zara talked about her husband, about the life they had built together before the war, about the plans they had made for Lyra's future that would never come to fruition. She talked about the guilt she felt for not being able to provide the kind of life her daughter deserved, the fear that she was failing as both mother and father in a world that seemed designed to crush anyone who wasn't strong enough to fight back. Marcus listened, offering the kind of quiet support that he had learned to provide for grieving families during his military service. But more than that, he found himself sharing his own experiences with loss, with the weight of survivors' guilt, with the challenge of finding meaning in a world that often seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful and good. They talked about Lyra's future, about the choices that would need to be made about her education and development. They talked about the sculpture project, and how it might serve as both a celebration of her father's memory and a foundation for her own artistic growth. Most importantly, they talked about the conversation that would eventually need to happen, the moment when hope would have to give way to truth, and Lyra would have to learn that some people who go away never come back home. "She will need something to hold on to when that day comes," Zara said. "Something that proves her father's love was real, even if he cannot be here to show it." Marcus nodded, understanding finally why this project mattered so much. It wasn't just about creating a beautiful object or teaching technical skills to a talented child. It was about creating something that could serve as a bridge between the life Lyra had known and the life she would have to build without her father, something that could hold the weight of love and loss and hope all at the same time. The sculpture was nearly finished by then, a delicate creation that combined flowing Zephyrian aesthetic principles with the kind of technical sophistication that would have been impossible to achieve with traditional methods. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was meaningful. Every element had been chosen and crafted to tell a specific part of the story that Lyra wanted to preserve, the story of a father who had taught his daughter to see beauty in the world and to create beauty for others to enjoy. But as Marcus looked at their creation, glowing softly in the dim light of the courtyard, he realized that the most important part of the project was not the sculpture itself. It was the relationships that had grown around it, the community that had formed through the simple act of working together toward a common goal. Lyra had found a mentor and friend in Marcus, but he had found something equally valuable in return, a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since his discharge from the military. The final phase of the project would require all of their combined skills and emotional resources, because it would involve not just completing the technical work, but also finding a way to honor both truth and hope in equal measure. Marcus was beginning to understand that this was what real peace looked like. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of people willing to care for each other across the boundaries of species and culture and personal history. As they sat together in the quiet courtyard, surrounded by the sounds of a community settling into sleep, Marcus felt something shift inside himself. For the first time in years, he was not just surviving from one day to the next. He was building something meaningful, something that would outlast the immediate moment and contribute to the kind of world that made all the fighting and sacrifice worthwhile. The empty lunchbox had become a symbol of something much larger than one family's loss. It had become a symbol of the possibility that hope could survive even the most devastating circumstances if there were people willing to help carry it forward. The sculpture was finally ready on a Tuesday morning when Kepler 442b's twin suns cast long shadows across the Zephyrian district. Marcus had spent the previous evening making final adjustments to the bioluminescent matrix that would allow the device to record and playback messages, ensuring that every technical element functioned exactly as intended. The object itself was beautiful beyond anything he had imagined when they first started the project, a flowing spiral of crystalline material that seemed to capture and hold light in patterns that shifted and evolved like living music. Lyra had been vibrating with excitement for days as they approached completion, constantly asking if today would be the day they could finally put her gift inside Papa's lunchbox. Marcus and Zara had agreed that they would finish the project first, and then Zara would have the conversation with her daughter that had been postponed for too long. The truth could not wait indefinitely, and they both knew that Lyra was beginning to sense the deception in the careful ways that adults avoided her questions. Marcus arrived at the fabrication lab early that morning to find Lyra already waiting outside with her mother, both of them carrying the nervous energy of people approaching a moment they knew would change everything. Zara looked like she had not slept, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the emotional toll that the coming conversation would exact. Lyra, by contrast, was practically bouncing with anticipation, clutching the lunchbox against her chest, as she had every day since Marcus returned it to her. "Today we finish Papa's gift," she announced as Marcus unlocked the lab, her English bright with the pride of a child who had mastered a complex project through weeks of dedicated work. "And then we can send him a message to tell him it is ready for when he comes home." Marcus exchanged a glance with Zara, seeing the pain that flickered across her face at her daughter's innocent assumption. They had planned this moment carefully, agreeing that the sculpture should be completed and properly installed in the lunchbox before the difficult conversation began. The gift needed to be real and finished, so that Lyra would have something concrete to hold on to when the abstract concept of permanent loss became an unavoidable reality. The final assembly process took most of the morning, with Lyra working alongside Marcus to integrate all the elements they had created over the previous weeks. The sculpture fit perfectly inside the lunchbox, its crystalline structure designed to complement the flowing lines of the container while providing multiple surfaces for the bioluminescent organisms to create their patterns of light and color. When activated, it would glow softly while playing back-recorded messages, creating an immersive experience that combined visual beauty with emotional connection. Lyra recorded the first message herself, speaking in the musical cadences of formal Zephyrian, as she told her father about the gift they had created together. She talked about everything she had learned during the project, about the new friends she had made, about how much she missed him, and how excited she was for him to see what she had accomplished. Her voice was full of love and hope, and the kind of innocent joy that could break an adult's heart with its purity. When the recording was finished, and the sculpture properly calibrated, Marcus stepped back to watch as Lyra closed the lunchbox with reverent care. The container now held something precious and meaningful, a tangible symbol of a daughter's love that would endure regardless of circumstances. The empty box had become something full of purpose. and Marcus felt a sense of completion that went beyond the mere technical achievement of the project. "It is beautiful," Zara said quietly, her voice thick with emotions she was struggling to control. "Your father would be so proud of what you have created." Lyra beamed at the praise, carefully tucking the lunchbox under her arm as they prepared to leave the fabrication lab. Marcus was cleaning up the workspace when Zara approached him, her expression serious in a way that made him pause in his activities. "I am going to tell her today," she said. "This afternoon when we get home, I cannot wait any longer, and she deserves to know the truth before she creates more memories based on false hope." Marcus nodded, understanding the courage that such a decision required. "Would you like me to be there? Not for the conversation itself, but afterward, when she might need additional support?" Zara considered this for a moment, then nodded gratefully. "I think she will have questions that I cannot answer. About war, about why people have to fight, about what happens when good people do not come home. You have experience with these things that I do not." The walk back to their building was subdued, with Lyra chattering happily about the completed project while the adults moved with the heavy awareness of what was coming. Marcus found himself thinking about all the similar conversations he had witnessed during his military service, the moments when families learned that hope had to give way to grief, that waiting had become mourning. There was no easy way to deliver such news, no perfect words that could soften the impact of devastating loss. Zara asked Marcus to wait in the courtyard while she and Lyra went upstairs for their conversation. He found himself pacing among the small garden plots that the residents maintained, unable to settle as he listened to the ordinary sounds of community life continuing around him. Children played in nearby apartments. Elderly voices discussed the day's news in musical Zephyrian cadences, and somewhere someone was cooking food that filled the air with spices that reminded him of worlds he had visited during his service. The scream came after about 20 minutes, a sound of pure anguish that cut through all other noise and brought immediate silence to the courtyard. Marcus was moving toward the building before he consciously decided to do so, taking the stairs as quickly as his prosthetic leg would allow. He could hear Lyra's wails echoing through the thin walls, the sound of a child's world collapsing in real time as she learned that her father would never come home to receive the gift she had made for him. Marcus paused outside the apartment door, uncertain whether his presence would be welcome at such a moment. But then he heard Zara calling his name, her voice breaking with the strain of trying to comfort her daughter while dealing with her own grief. He entered to find Lyra collapsed on the small couch, the lunchbox clutched against her chest as she cried with the devastating intensity that only children could achieve. "She wants to know why," Zara said helplessly, tears streaming down her own face. "Why did Papa have to die? Why do wars happen? Why cannot the people who start the fighting be the ones who die instead of the fathers who just want to protect their families?" Marcus sat down carefully beside Lyra, giving her space while making his presence available. He had learned during his military service that children in crisis often needed the physical proximity of adults who could provide stability, even when they were too overwhelmed to accept direct comfort. Lyra's crying gradually subsided into the exhausted breathing of someone who had spent all their emotional energy at once. "Papa is not coming home," she said finally, her voice small and broken in a way that made Marcus want to punch something. "Mama says he died being brave, but I do not understand why brave people have to die. I do not understand why I made this gift for someone who will never see it." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, the same sensation he had experienced when he first found the lunchbox weeks ago. But this time, instead of pain, he felt a strange kind of clarity. He understood finally why he had been drawn to this child and her family, why he had felt compelled to insert himself into their lives at a moment of crisis. "Can I tell you something about your father?" he said gently. something that might help you understand why the gift you made is still important, even though he cannot come home to receive it." Lyra looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, her face streaked with tears, but showing the first spark of attention she had managed since learning the truth. Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "During the war, I met many soldiers who had families they were fighting to protect. They all carried something with them, some reminder of the people they loved and the reasons they were willing to risk their lives. Pictures, letters, small objects that their children had made for them. These things were more important to them than weapons or equipment because they reminded the soldiers what they were fighting for." He gestured toward the lunchbox that Lyra still held against her chest. "Your father may not have been able to come home to receive your gift, but he carried the love behind it with him every single day. Every time he made a difficult decision, every time he chose to be brave instead of afraid, he was thinking about you and your mother and the life he wanted you to have. The gift you made was not just for when he came home. It was the reason he was willing to fight in the first place." Lyra considered this, her young mind wrestling with concepts that were difficult even for adults to fully understand. But if he was thinking about us, why did he not just come home instead of staying to fight? It was the question that every military family struggled with, the impossible balance between duty and love that defined life during wartime. Marcus had asked similar questions about his own father, about the choices that took parents away from their children even when everyone involved would have preferred a different outcome. Because he knew that if he came home while the fighting was still happening, the war would eventually come to you, Marcus said. He chose to face the danger in space so that you and your mother could be safe on this world. He chose to protect not just his own family, but all the families who lived here. Zara had been listening to this conversation with obvious relief, grateful to have someone else help her daughter process the impossible complexities of loss and sacrifice. Now she moved to sit on Lyra's other side, creating a circle of support that surrounded the grieving child. "Marcus is right," she said softly. "Papa's last message to the Fleet Command mentioned you specifically. He said that everything he did was so that his daughter could grow up in a universe where beauty was more powerful than fear. The gift you made proves that he succeeded." Marcus watched as understanding began to dawn on Lyra's face, the realization that her father's death was connected to her own ability to create beautiful things in safety. It was a complex emotional equation for a child to process, but he could see her beginning to grasp the fundamental truth, that love sometimes required sacrifice, and that sacrifice could be meaningful even when it resulted in permanent loss. "The sculpture we made," Lyra said slowly, "it will keep playing Papa's messages, even though he is not here to make new ones?" Marcus nodded. "For as long as you want it to. And you can record new messages to him whenever you want to tell him about things that happen in your life. The gift works both ways." This seemed to provide some comfort to Lyra, the idea that communication could continue even across the ultimate barrier of death. She opened the lunchbox carefully, looking at the sculpture they had created together as if seeing it for the first time. The crystalline structure caught the afternoon light streaming through the apartment windows, creating patterns of refracted color that danced across the walls like living art. "I want to record a message for Papa now," she said with sudden determination. "I want to tell him that I understand why he had to be brave, and that I will try to be brave too." The message she recorded was heartbreaking in its simple eloquence. She told her father that she missed him terribly, but that she was proud of him for protecting other children like herself. She promised to use the skills she had learned during their project to create beautiful things that would make the world a better place. Most importantly, she told him that she would remember the lessons he had taught her about love being stronger than fear, and that she would try to live in a way that honored his sacrifice. When she finished recording, the sculpture glowed softly as it processed and stored her words, the bioluminescent organisms responding to the emotional resonance in her voice by creating patterns of light that were particularly beautiful. Marcus found himself thinking about the technology they had used, how it had been developed originally for military communications, but had been adapted for this deeply personal purpose. Sometimes the tools of war could be transformed into instruments of healing if there were people willing to make that choice. The weeks that followed brought a gradual transformation in Lyra's relationship with her grief. She still missed her father terribly, still had moments when the reality of his absence hit her with fresh intensity. But she also began to find meaning in the project they had completed together, taking pride in the technical skills she had learned and the artistic vision she had helped to realize. More importantly, she began to see herself as part of a larger community of people who had lost family members to the war, but were determined to build something positive from their experiences. Other children in the district started asking Marcus to help them with their own projects, and soon he found himself running informal workshops in the fabrication lab, teaching technical skills while helping young people process their own experiences of loss and displacement. Zara threw herself into this community-building effort, using her traditional weaving skills to teach other mothers while learning new techniques from Marcus that allowed them to create textiles with embedded technological features. The apartment that had once felt cramped and marginal became a gathering place where families shared resources and knowledge, building the kind of mutual support network that made survival possible and healing achievable. Marcus discovered that his own wounds were beginning to heal through this work. The sense of purpose that had been missing from his civilian life was restored through the daily choice to use his skills in service of something meaningful. The guilt he had carried from his military service was not erased, but it was balanced by the knowledge that he was helping to build the kind of world that made all the fighting and sacrifice worthwhile. 6 months after completing the sculpture project, Marcus received news that would change everything once again. The Zephyrian Fleet Command had established a new memorial program, creating a permanent record of all the service members who had died during the conflict. Families were invited to submit personal artifacts and recordings that would be preserved in a cultural archive, ensuring that the individual stories of loss and love would not be forgotten as history moved forward. Lyra decided to submit her father's lunchbox and the sculpture they had created together, along with all the recordings she had made over the months since learning of his death. It was a difficult decision, requiring her to let go of the physical objects that had provided comfort during her grief. But she understood that sharing her family's story might help other children who were facing similar losses, and that felt more important than keeping the artifacts for herself. The submission ceremony was held in the central plaza of New Geneva, with families from multiple species gathering to honor their lost loved ones. Marcus stood with Lyra and Zara as they placed the lunchbox in the archive vault, watching as it joined hundreds of other personal items that represented the human cost of the conflict that had officially ended but continued to shape daily life across the galaxy. Lyra spoke briefly about her father and the project they had completed in his memory, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the assembled crowd. She talked about learning that love could survive death, that beauty could emerge from loss, and that communities could heal together in ways that no individual could achieve alone. Her words were translated into multiple languages, but the emotional truth they contained needed no translation. After the ceremony, as families began to disperse back to their daily lives, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had begun with finding an empty lunchbox in a pile of construction debris. The simple act of returning lost property had evolved into something much larger, a relationship that had changed multiple lives, a project that had taught him about the power of hope and creativity to transform grief into something meaningful. Lyra approached him as they prepared to leave the plaza, her expression serious in the way that children looked when they were about to say something important. "Marcus," she said, using the formal tone that Zephyrians employed for significant announcements. I want you to know that you have become like family to me and Mama. Not to replace Papa, but to be a new kind of family that we chose instead of just receiving. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked down at this remarkable child who had taught him so much about resilience and grace. You have become family to me too, he said. The most important family I have ever had. As they walked home through the busy streets of New Geneva, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred in all their lives. Lyra had learned to carry her grief without being crushed by it, finding ways to honor her father's memory while building her own future. Zara had discovered strength she had not known she possessed, creating stability for her daughter while contributing to the broader community's healing process. Most surprisingly, Marcus had learned that his military service had not been the end of his story, but preparation for a different kind of mission. The skills he had developed during years of conflict could be used to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to create the kind of connections between people that made peace more than just the absence of war. The empty lunchbox had become a symbol of something profound. The way that love could survive any loss, the way that communities could form around shared purpose, and the way that hope could be rebuilt even in the face of devastating tragedy. It represented everything that made humanity worth celebrating, not because humans were perfect or superior to other species, but because they were willing to recognize suffering and respond with compassion, to see need and answer with service. That evening, as Marcus prepared for sleep in his own small apartment, he thought about the message that Lyra's story would carry to other families facing similar losses. The archive would preserve not just the artifacts they had created together, but the proof that healing was possible, that beauty could emerge from darkness, that love was indeed stronger than fear if there were people willing to act on that belief. The empty lunchbox had taught them all something essential about what it meant to be human in a universe that often seemed determined to crush hope and compassion. It had shown them that the most powerful response to loss was not despair or anger, but the decision to create something beautiful that would outlast the circumstances that caused it. And in creating that beauty together across the boundaries of species and culture and personal history, they had discovered what real peace looked like. Not the mere absence of conflict, but the presence of people willing to care for each other no matter what the universe threw at them. Marcus smiled as he drifted off to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to use his skills in service of that vision. New chances to prove that hope was not naive, but revolutionary, and that the simple act of caring for one another was the most human thing of all.